Over the last few days, the US has started warning that China is about to start supplying arms to Russia to aid them in their war against Ukraine. The first warnings came early last week, just after US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held a fiery bilateral on the sides of the Munich Security Conference, with US intelligence claiming that China was considering sending lethal support and that this would cause a serious problem for the Sino-American relationship. Blinken then said that the US was considering releasing the relevant intelligence, presumably to deter China from going ahead with it, and while this hasn't happened yet, its classification has been downgraded, which means that, while it's not available to the general public, the intelligence has now been shared with allies. We got some more details of what this might involve last week, when Der Spiegel reported that a Chinese company were considering selling kamikaze drones like the Iranian-made Shahed drones that Russia is currently using, and a US intelligence official told Politico that Beijing was also considering sending ammunition and small arms. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, warned Beijing that supplying lethal aid would be a red line for the EU, and NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that it would be a very big mistake. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at whether this might actually happen, and if it does, how much of a difference it could make to the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. So let's start with the big question. Is this actually going to happen? Is China actually going to send arms to Russia, as the US claims? Well, there are reasons to be sceptical. For starters, while US intelligence has proved remarkably prescient so far, and Blinken is clearly anxious about it, last week Biden seemed to contradict him, telling reporters that there was no evidence that China was planning on sending lethal aid, and that he didn't think it would happen. It's hard to square these comments with what Blinken said after the Munich Security Conference, and while it's possible that Biden misspoke, his comments suggest that the US isn't quite as sure about its intelligence as Blinken originally made out. It's also worth saying that, according to polling, only 7% of Chinese citizens favour sending arms to Russia, and the Chinese state has also denied these allegations outright. Last week, the CCP dismissed the claims as false and urged the US to stop shifting blame and spreading false information. Now, obviously, this is what you'd expect. It's not like the CCP were just going to admit to it and kickstart World War III, but it is hard to square these reports with China's recent diplomatic efforts. Last week, China produced its much-anticipated peace plan for Ukraine, which included a proposal for a ceasefire, a resumption of peace talks, and calls for de-escalation. As we mentioned in our video on the plan over on TLDR Global, it went down well with much of the world, especially with the Global South, who just want to see an end to the war in Ukraine as soon as possible. If China can successfully negotiate a peace in Ukraine, which doesn't look impossible, given that Zelensky and Putin have reacted relatively well to the plan, then it'll establish itself as a diplomatic powerhouse and earn the gratitude of most of the international community. This is presumably why China has started subtly downplaying the strength of its relationship with Russia. In a readout after his trip to Russia last week, China's foreign minister conspicuously avoided describing the China-Russia partnership as having no limits, as he did last year before Putin invaded. And other CCP members have stressed that China considers both Ukraine and Russia to be strategic partners. If the CCP can convince Kyiv that they're truly neutral on the issue of Ukraine, then China might be able to act as a mediator in the conflict, which would be great for China's soft power and international image. Obviously, sending arms to Russia would look deeply hypocritical and do further damage to China's reputation abroad. Anyway, you get the idea. At the moment, it's in China's apparent self-interest to push for peace instead of escalating the conflict by arming Russia. However, China's calculus might change if the peace plan fails, because China won't want Russia to lose the war outright, for a few reasons. For starters, if Russia loses, then Putin may well be replaced, and whoever succeeds him is unlikely to be as friendly with China. Putin and Xi have a great personal relationship, and under his leadership, Sino-Russian relations have reached new highs. In the CCP's worst-case scenario, Putin could be replaced with a more pro-Western leader, possibly via a colour revolution, which would further isolate China in the emerging great power competition with the US. And even if Putin is replaced by a hawkish Russian nationalist, they won't be as reliable a partner as Putin has been. On top of that, a win for Ukraine would essentially amount to a win for the US. And China won't want this because it'll make the US a more appealing security partner for China-skeptic countries in the Asia-Pacific, and because it might embolden the US to take an even more hawkish stance on Taiwan. We've already seen a rapid escalation of tensions over Taiwan in the past few years. And a week ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that the US was planning to expand its troop presence on the island to help Taiwanese forces prepare for an invasion. This is particularly worrying because the CCP have made it clear that under the One China doctrine, an American troop presence on the island would essentially constitute an invasion, which is why the normalization of US-China relations in the 70s required the withdrawal of all US troops from Taiwan. If China does decide to arm Russia in order to deny the US a strategic victory, Chinese aid could make a real difference on the battlefield. According to reports, China isn't considering sending high-tech equipment like jets or tanks. Instead, they're looking at more cheap and simple stuff like artillery, ammunition, and kamikaze drones that can be mass-produced at scale. This might not sound that impressive, but the war in Ukraine has become increasingly attritional, and quantity is more important than quality in attritional conflicts. Given the reports that the Russian army is running low on both ammunition and the reduced frequency of kamikaze drone attacks, lots of artillery and drones could be exactly what Russia needs, and China definitely has the production capacity for it. All in all, while it might not look super likely right now, if China were to significantly step up support for Russia, this would be a disaster, both for Ukraine and the world more generally, because it would massively increase the chances of a much bigger conflict sometime soon. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see how this shakes out, but this is a worrying moment for Ukraine and the world more generally. If you want to be updated as it does play out, then be sure to subscribe to the TLDR Daily Briefing. Over there, we break down the biggest news stories each day, before running you through 3 other stories that you might have missed in the day's chaos. It's the quickest and easiest way to stay on top of the news and make it sound like you know what you're talking about. And as it's from TLDR, you know it's unbiased and easy to understand. You can find the video every weekday over on the TLDR Daily YouTube channel, or if you'd prefer, you can listen by searching in your favourite podcast app.